So Bridge is one of the leading and largest technology-enabled education providers in emerging markets. Today, we've educated 800,000 children across 1,600 schools in 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia and East Asia. We've built a team of more than 7,000 employees around the world in order to help us accomplish this vision. And before I tell you a little bit about the results we've been able to achieve for students and how we do that, let me tell you about how we got started and why we got started. We believed and still believe that the world needs what we're calling an education moonshot. A moonshot that doesn't deliver incremental improvements in education, but through technology and a bold or audacious plan, delivers dramatic or world-changing education results. And the world needs this because it's a pretty dire situation. There are 800 million children around the world who live on less than $2 per person per day. And on average, these children from low-income countries, on international exams, they perform at the 3rd percentile compared to their peers in wealthy countries. Now, on their own exams in their own countries, less than half of them pass those exams in order to matriculate into secondary school. Now, if you come from the perspective that we do, that natural ability and intelligence is scattered or distributed equally around the world, but it's just the opportunity, the education that's needed to realize that potential that is not, then what you realize is it's not that the children are failing, it's that the systems that are designed to enable them to succeed are failing them. And this is the reason why we need this education moonshot. Now, for an individual child, in terms of what a really high-quality education can do for them, I think the results are the need is pretty obvious. But there's also significant economic consequences at a nationwide or at a global level. Stanford economist Eric Hanushek has actually shown, not using this slide, that the entire difference between the GDP growth of the famous East Asian tigers compared to countries who have not grown as much in terms of their GDP is almost entirely explained by differences in the educational attainment of the children in those countries. He's quantified it, and he shows that a gain of a half a standard deviation, which I'll talk to you about later about how we do that, actually generates over about 2 decades a 5% growth in the GDP of a country. Now that's trillions of dollars of additional economic output. This is why we need that education moonshot. Now when we set out to attempt this moonshot, we set out sort of 4 core criteria that we knew would be critical in order to achieve this. So first, efficacy, the learning outcomes themselves, the quality of the learning. You needed to be able to double those pass rates on national exams. You needed to quadruple the natural fluency rate of children in a country. Price point, this was really critical. In order to deliver on this moonshot, you needed to be able to work on the existing budgets in low-income countries today. You couldn't expect a dramatic change in the amount of money available, so you needed to be able to deliver these dramatic gains on less than $10 per student per month. Now, scale, the need and the opportunity is millions of students, so you needed to be able to design a solution that could work for millions. And speed, we couldn't let another generation of children be lost, so you need to do this in a short number of years. So how do you land that moonshot? Well, you start by treating education as a science that it is and deserves to be, the science of learning. And you accomplish this by leveraging data. Now, education is inherently data-rich if you design it from day one with that in mind, leveraging data to treat education as a science. So what can you learn from 1 billion data points? What have we learned from 1 billion education data points each year? What have we learned when you apply the science of things like randomized control trials, like pharmaceutical companies test medicines, or A versus B testing, like an e-commerce company assesses its app changes? What happens when you apply that to the actual science of learning and instructional delivery? You can learn everything from the micro to the macro. For example, you can learn that in a typical science class in the last 10 minutes, instead of having children work on an example with the textbook open in front of them, if instead, during that 10 minutes at the end of the class, you remove the textbook, you remove what turns out to be an intellectual crutch for a number of students, You can actually generate gains in core science areas by 8% over the course of a term. You can learn, for example, that in a typical math class in the beginning, the first 8 minutes, where a teacher is typically at the blackboard reviewing a worked example with the students, that if instead during that 8 minutes you replace that with an interactive quiz and you consistently do that across a term, you can improve students' achievement in core math areas by 14%. You can learn, for example, that the typical structure that's done in many classes where the homework or the classwork is focused just on today's lesson or on yesterday's lesson. And instead, you interleave or you spiral content from across the term, and you consistently do that across the year. You can generate an educational gain of nearly a quarter of a standard deviation. You can learn this and hundreds of other facts if you design this from day one. And the question is running these experiments or using this data and analyzing it expensive? Well, if you build it into the system, it doesn't have to be. So how do we do this at Bridge? Well, we've spent the last 10 years designing and testing a technology-enabled learning ecosystem that takes and marries technology and big data with the transformation of human capital in schools and classrooms in order to improve learning outcomes at large scale. Now, it starts by equipping every teacher with a tablet custom designed and connected to our learning platform in the cloud. That allows us to have a separate academic R&D team that uses the science of learning to generate scientifically based, data-driven, and research-driven lesson plans that are then digitally distributed to tens of thousands of teachers in thousands of communities around the world. That means that every teacher is able to access a scientifically based, high-quality pedagogy in their teaching for every subject for every day. Now, that same platform, which collects 1 billion education data points a year, is then able to use randomized control trials, A versus B testing, big data analytics, to constantly optimize and customize those learning activities to what's needed in those schools and in those classrooms. Effectively, we learn faster about how children learn because we have this phenomenal combination of statistically significant sample sizes on day one, low cost of data acquisition, and the ability to isolate the hundreds of different variables that go into effective instructional delivery in a classroom. Now, that same technology platform is used to increase the level of professionalism and accountability across the board. So we're not just measuring and analyzing what time do teachers show up for their period 5 math class, but what percentage of the class did they deliver? How fast or how slow did they deliver that lesson? What percentage was completed? How did the students perform? And how did that compare to other teachers in the same region or community teaching that same topic or around the world? So we're able to then provide that feedback both directly to the teacher to reflect on their own teaching practice, as well as to specially equipped smartphone apps in the field with quality assurance supervisors, professional development coaches, and teams that are able to support what happens in the learning in that classroom. Support all of that on the back end with a back office that's data-driven for operations and systems and analysis. And you're able to generate these types of learning gains. Not just when you see all of this, you'd think in the wealthiest countries in the world, but in the lowest income countries in the world. And what that requires is designing for day one for ultra-low infrastructure environments. Environments where the majority of schools do not have electricity. Environments where there are no internet connectivities wired to a school. Where there is no 3G internet access in the community. And where the 2G access is only available for perhaps 20 minutes a day. We started from ground one with those constraints to design a technology platform that can work across the world's majority of schools that exist in these conditions. So after 10 years of designing and testing and rolling out and implementing this, we can now confidently say that this moonshot is landing across the core areas that we set out. First, in terms of learning gains, in terms of efficacy, one of the things that we've been able to show is that changes in learning, improvements in learning, don't have to take an entire generation. They can happen rapidly. They can happen in a year. In a country in West Africa, we showed across the public school system an 85% reduction in teacher absenteeism in less than a year. We've been able to work with governments, this one in Nigeria, to rebuild the public's trust or faith in the government school system and record a 22% enrollment in public schools across the state. And inside classrooms, change the practice of teaching. Massive reductions in corporal punishment, doubling the amount of feedback teachers are giving to students. And about a dozen different research studies over the years have shown that this now, at schools supported by Bridge, generates dramatic learning gains. In East Africa, we've been able to show that you can double the pass rates on national exams from students from the lowest income areas of the country. In Liberia, we were able to triple the percentage of children who could read after just 2 years. And in one state in Nigeria, students were learning almost an entire year's worth of learning gains in just a little over 2 months. You can dramatically change the learning outcomes when you apply the science of learning, systematization, and data in order to change the entire ecosystem. And you can deliver this at very low cost, at radically cost-effective prices that allows it to work in the lowest income countries in the world. We were using technology and systems to drive down the cost, so much so that now our ability to deliver is on less than what low-income countries' governments spend on their own public schools. So now this type of dramatic education transformation is not just affordable, but is funded by low-income country governments on their existing school budget. It means that this type of transformation can access or address the entirety of the need where the need is most. In terms of scale, we've now educated 800,000 students, but we've built out a platform that focuses on the ability to serve millions more. And in terms of speed, historically, we've scaled out at a rate of 1 new school every 2.5 calendar days. But now, this year, we're at a pace of nearly 3 new schools every single calendar day. Our near-term goal is to reach 10 million children around emerging markets around the world. We've been able to bring together an incredibly forward-looking group of investors from venture capitalists and individual investors, private equity funds, and sovereign wealth funds who are focused on how do you deliver this at scale, and recognizing from day one that it would take 10 years to build out the technology, the science of learning, the systems in order to deliver that. So that now, in terms of when we've been able to prove that you can deliver this, large, dramatic changes in educational outcomes, rapidly, at price points that are affordable by low-income country government budgets for their own public schools, we're scaling out quite rapidly. Current trajectory has us adding 1 million children over the next 12 months. We've been able to work with leading statewide, national, and global figures who have joined us on this journey, on this moonshot. We're thrilled to be able to bring together a lot of these individuals from around the globe. And all of this because we believe that if you can educate a single child with a high-quality basic primary school education, you can fundamentally change this child's life forever. But if you can do this for hundreds or thousands of children in a single community, and then you can replicate that across hundreds or thousands of communities across dozens of countries in emerging markets, we think it's possible to change the world. Thank you.